Picture a quiet room in a great museum. The good kind of quiet, the hush of people who know they are looking at something important. On an easel under a soft light sits a painting nobody has ever seen before. A lost Vermeer. A genuine, newly discovered work by Johannes Vermeer, the Dutch master, the man who painted light itself, the man who left the world only a small handful of pictures. And here, impossibly, is one more. Christ and his disciples at a table in Emmaus, the faces soft and grave, the colors deep and still. The greatest Vermeer expert alive has already blessed it, has called it in print a masterpiece, perhaps the finest thing the master ever made. The room leans in. Somebody, somewhere, is close to tears. A treasure has come home. And over in the corner, saying nothing, stands a man with tired eyes and paint under his fingernails. A second-rate painter the critics wrote off years ago. He watches the experts weep over the greatest Vermeer of them all. And he knows something none of them do. He painted it, last year, in his own kitchen. Sit with that for a moment. The finest Vermeer in the world, and it came out of the hands of a man they all agreed had no talent. And it is about to make him rich. And it is about to sell a picture to a Nazi. And it is about to end, years from now, with this same forger begging a courtroom to believe he is a criminal, because the only thing that can save his life is proving that his masterpieces are fakes. So settle in. This one is my favorite. Let me tell you about the man who fooled everyone who ever sneered at him. I'm Eddie. Hello. I collect these stories the way some men collect stamps, a little obsessively, and with a slightly guilty grin. I've never actually pulled a con myself, I should confess that up front. The closest I've come is a scheme my mate Sully and I once sketched out over 3 pints, which collapsed the instant we tried to explain it to a sober person the next morning. So I'm not the artist. I'm the man in the front row watching the trick, muttering how did he do that under my breath. And of all the cons I've ever studied, the men who sold monuments they didn't own, the swindlers who made banks print them fortunes, this painter, has a hold on me that the others don't. Because Hermann van Meegeren didn't con people out of money, not first, not really. He conned them out of their certainty. He took the most confident men in the art world, men whose entire life was knowing the real from the fake, and he made fools of them, one after another, and they thanked him for it. And then, because history has a sense of humor, the whole thing turned itself inside out and the forger became a folk hero. It's a beautiful story. It's also a much darker one than the cheerful version you may have heard, and I'm going to tell you both. So pour yourself something. Let me introduce you to a very bitter, very gifted man. Hermann van Meegeren was born in the Netherlands in 1889. And from the start, there was a war going on inside him between what he wanted to be and what the world was willing to let him be. What he wanted was to be a great painter, a real one, in the grand old manner, beautiful, technically flawless, the kind of picture that hangs in a museum and makes strangers go quiet. He had the hands for it, genuinely. The man could draw like an angel. But he was born into the wrong century for what he loved. By the time Van Meegeren was grown, the art world had fallen in love with the new, with the modern, the experimental, the bold, and the broken. And here was this young man painting careful, old-fashioned, pretty pictures in a style everybody had decided was dead. He had some early success, sold some work, made some money doing portraits and prints. But when he showed the critics his serious paintings, the paintings he poured his soul into, they were not kind. They called him derivative, unoriginal, a skilled imitator with nothing of his own to say, a man who could copy the masters but could never be one. Now, I want you to feel the size of that wound, because everything, the whole con, the whole strange life, grows out of it. Imagine believing to the bottom of your soul that you are as good as the old masters. And imagine the whole clever, fashionable art establishment patting you on the head and telling you that you are second-rate, that you were born to imitate and not to create. If you have ever been certain of your own worth and watched the people who decide such things wave you away, if you've ever wanted, just once, to prove the clever people wrong, then you have a thread of what was burning in Van Meegeren. Because he did not decide to get even by painting better. He decided to get even by proving that the experts, the critics, the men who judged him, could not tell his hand from the hand of a genius. He would beat them at the one thing they were sure they were good at. So here is the plan taking shape in the mind of a scorned and brilliant man. He would not sign his own name. Nobody wanted his name. He would paint a picture so perfectly in the manner of a beloved master that the greatest experts in the world would fall to their knees in front of it and declare it genuine. And then, at the moment of his choosing, he could reveal the truth and laugh in all their faces. Look what your second-rate imitator made. Look what you kneeled to. And of all the masters he could have chosen, he chose the hardest and the smartest target imaginable, Johannes Vermeer. Now, why Vermeer? This is where you have to admire the strategy, because it's the same cold logic every great con runs on. Vermeer was perfect precisely because so little of him survived. Only a small number of paintings are firmly agreed to be his, a few dozen at most, and his life was poorly documented. There were gaps, mysteries, whole stretches of his career where scholars simply did not know what he had painted, and into a gap like that, a clever man can build a house. There was even a theory floating around the scholars of the day, a genuine, respectable art historical idea, that Vermeer, early in his life, must have painted large religious scenes, biblical subjects, before he settled into the quiet domestic pictures he's famous for. The problem was, none had ever been found. The experts wanted them to exist. They were half expecting them. There was a Vermeer-shaped hole in the record, and the men who studied him longed for someone to fill it. Rule one of any con, my friend. You never sell a man a lie. You find the truth he is already aching to believe, and you hand him that. Van Meegeren didn't have to convince the experts that a lost religious Vermeer might exist. They'd convinced themselves of that already. He just had to walk in and be the answer to a prayer they'd been saying for years. And a mark who is praying for exactly what you're selling is a mark who checks nothing. But wanting to fool the experts and actually fooling them are two different countries, and the border between them is where most forgers get caught. Because here's the trap. A painting is not just an image. It's an object. It's a physical thing with an age. And the experts of the 20th century had science on their side. A 300-year-old painting behaves like a 300-year-old thing. The paint is rock hard, dried through over centuries. The surface is covered in craquelure, that fine web of tiny cracks that spreads across an old picture as it ages and the layers shift. And if a suspicious expert takes a cotton swab with a little alcohol on it and dabs a corner, a fresh modern painting will smear, the paint will lift, because it's still, chemically, young and soft. A genuine old master will not so much as flinch. That test alone had unmasked 100 forgers. So Van Meegeren spent years, and I mean years. This is not a weekend hobby. This is a man giving a huge chunk of his one life to a grudge solving that problem. And I'm going to tell you what he did, at the level the history tells it, because the audacity of the problem solving is the whole point. But I'm not handing you a recipe, and you'll see in a minute why the recipe wouldn't help you anyway. He started with genuinely old canvas. He'd buy a real, worthless, third-rate 17th century painting and strip it down, so that underneath his work sat authentically antique fabric and tacks and an old wooden stretcher, the kind that would survive an examination. He ground his own colors the old way, trying to use only pigments that would have been available in Vermeer's time, so that if a chemist analyzed a fleck of paint, nothing anachronistic would leap out and scream forgery. That much a careful forger might manage. But the masterstroke, the thing that made him different from every dauber who ever tried this, was how he made the paint old. He mixed his pigments not just with oil, but with an early industrial plastic, a synthetic resin of the phenol formaldehyde family, the same broad chemistry as bakelite, that hard, shiny material they were making telephones and radios out of. And then he baked the finished painting in an oven, gently, for hours, curing the paint until it went genuinely, physically hard like a picture that had dried for 3 centuries, hard enough to pass the alcohol swab without a flinch. And then, to give it that final signature of great age, he would roll the stiffened canvas over a cylinder to crack the surface into a web of craquelure, and work grime, ink, dust down into the cracks so it looked like the settled dirt of ages. Now here's why that isn't a how-to before anyone gets clever ideas. This trick worked on the science of the 1930s. The moment the world knew to look for that particular plastic, the whole method became a fingerprint. It's part of how forgeries got caught later. What you're admiring here isn't a repeatable crime. It's one man once outthinking the exact experts of his exact moment. That's the art of it. And it is, I have to say, a genuinely dazzling piece of nerve. He didn't just paint a fake. He engineered an object that could survive being doubted. And in 1937, all those years of grudge and craft came to a single, glorious point. Van Meegeren produced his masterpiece, his fake masterpiece, a large, somber, religious painting he called The Supper at Emmaus. Christ at the table with the disciples who suddenly recognize him. It didn't look much like the Vermeers everyone knew, the quiet women by the window. But that was the point. This was supposed to be the lost early Vermeer, the young Vermeer, the biblical Vermeer the scholars had dreamed of. It filled the hole in the record exactly. And then came the moment the whole con had been built for. The painting was brought before Abraham Bredius. Now you have to understand who Bredius was. He was not some gullible amateur. He was, at that time, arguably the single most respected authority on Dutch old masters in the world, the reigning expert on Vermeer himself, a scholar whose word could make or break an attribution, a man who had spent a long lifetime learning to tell the real from the false. If Bredius said a painting was a Vermeer, then as far as the art world was concerned, it was a Vermeer. Bredius looked at The Supper at Emmaus, and he did not just accept it. He fell in love. He declared it genuine, authentic, the real thing, and more than that, he called it a masterpiece, one of the greatest works Vermeer had ever produced, perhaps the finest of all. The lost religious Vermeer he and others had theorized about, found at last, and more beautiful than they dared hope. The elderly expert was, by all accounts, overwhelmed by it. And do you feel the terrible, delicious symmetry of that? The scorned imitator, the man Bredius's whole world had dismissed as a talentless copyist. That man had just painted the picture the greatest expert alive would call the crown of a genius. The forgery wasn't merely accepted. It was adored. The painting was bought for a colossal sum by a Rotterdam museum, celebrated as a national treasure, hung in a place of honor where crowds came to gaze at the newly discovered Vermeer. And its true author stood in the crowd, anonymous, ruined feeling and secretly, savagely triumphant. He had proved his point. He was as good as the masters. He had the receipt, and the receipt was hanging on a museum wall with the wrong name under it. And here is where the con eats the con man, the way it always seems to. Because Van Meegeren had a choice at this moment, the same choice every one of these stories arrives at. He had one. Completely. He could have walked into a newspaper office the next week and announced the whole thing. I painted your masterpiece. Your great expert kissed a forgery. Here is my proof. And become the most famous, most vindicated, most talked about artist in the Netherlands. The revenge would have been total. That, after all, was supposedly the entire point. He didn't do it, and I think I know why, and it's the most human thing in the whole story. Because the supper at Emmaus had made him rich. Suddenly, gloriously, filthily rich, richer than his real paintings had ever made him. And it turns out that revenge is a fine motive right up until money walks into the room, and then money tends to win. Why confess, why blow up the golden goose when you could just paint another one, and another, and keep the fortune flowing? So the revenge quietly curdled into a business. Van Meegeren went on producing newly discovered old masters, more religious Vermeers, and works dressed up as other 17th century Dutch painters too, and feeding them into the market through dealers and middlemen, each one certified, sold, and celebrated, each one pouring money into his pockets. Exactly how many he made across the whole run, honestly, nobody can say for certain. The accounts differ, and some works are still argued over to this day. And the total he earned is likewise an estimate, but by any measure it was a fortune, a great roaring river of money. He bought houses. He lived lavishly. The bitter little imitator was now one of the wealthiest painters in the country, and not one soul knew it was built on a lie. And notice what's happened to him, because this is the part the folk hero version skips. The revenge is gone. The noble sting against the arrogant experts, that's finished. What's left is a man getting rich by deceiving buyers, museums, and collectors in his own country, selling them fantasies and pocketing their money. He's not striking a blow for wounded artists anymore. He's just a very good crook who found a very deep well. Hold on to that. We're going to need it. And then history did the thing history does, which is arrive uninvited and change what your crimes mean. Because while Van Meegeren was quietly manufacturing masterpieces, the world fell into war, and the Netherlands was occupied. And the occupation brought to the Dutch art market a particular kind of customer, the conquerors, hunting for treasure. The most voracious of them all was Hermann Goering, one of the most powerful men in Nazi Germany, a man assembling a vast, greedy, looted art collection to feed his own vanity. And Goring wanted a Vermeer. Of course he did. What's a great collection without the great Dutch master? And so one of Van Meegeren's forged Vermeers, a religious scene called Christ with the Adulteress, made its way, through dealers and go-betweens, into the hands of Hermann Goering. I want to be careful with the exact chain here, because these deals ran through middlemen and the details get told a few different ways. But the essential, extraordinary fact is not in doubt. A painting that Van Meegeren had cooked in his own oven ended up in the private art hoard of a leading Nazi, traded by some accounts for a fortune or a great stack of other looted works. Stop and hold that image. Hermann Goering, gloating over his prize Vermeer, one of the jewels of his stolen collection, a picture that a scorned little Dutchman had knocked out in his studio and aged in an oven. Goering, of all people, comprehensively conned. If you'd told Van Meegeren the schoolboy that one day he'd fool a Nazi warlord with a homemade Vermeer, Even his revenge fantasies couldn't have reached that high. But of course, and this is the whole hinge of the story, at the time, it didn't feel like a triumph. It felt like a noose, because Van Meegeren had no idea that selling that painting was about to become the most dangerous thing he'd ever done. The war ends. The Nazis are beaten. The Netherlands is liberated. And across occupied Europe, the Allies and the newly freed nations start doing something very serious. They hunt down the looted art, and they hunt down the people who collaborated with the enemy. And in the recovered treasures from Goring's collection, they find it. A Vermeer, a genuine, priceless Dutch national treasure, Christ with the adulteress in the hands of a top Nazi. And the obvious, damning question: how did one of Holland's greatest artistic treasures come to be sold to the enemy? Who did that? Who sold a piece of the nation's soul to Hermann Goering? They trace it back, through the dealers, through the middlemen, and it leads them in the spring of 1945 to a wealthy Amsterdam painter named Jan van Meegeren. And they arrest him. Not for forgery, nobody yet dreams of forgery. They arrest him for collaboration, for plundering Dutch cultural heritage and selling it to the Nazi enemy. And in that raw, furious post-liberation moment, that was not a slap on the wrist. That was treason. That was the kind of charge that could put a man in front of a firing squad or on the end of a rope. Just look at the position he's in. To the world, Jan van Meegeren is a traitor, a man who sold a beloved Vermeer to Hermann Goering for personal profit while his country suffered under occupation. He is facing possible execution, and he holds, locked inside his own head, the one secret that could save his life. There was no Vermeer. He never sold a national treasure. He sold Goring a worthless fake he'd painted himself. He didn't rob his country. He robbed a Nazi with a picture he made in his kitchen. And now, my favorite reversal in the whole history of cons, to escape a charge of treason, the master forger has to do the one thing every forger spends his whole life avoiding. He has to prove his masterpieces are fakes. He has to convince the world that he is not a traitor, by confessing that he is a criminal of a completely different kind, that he fooled Bredius, that he fooled the museums, that the celebrated lost Vermeers, the national treasures, the crown of the master's career, all of them came off his easel. He has to burn down his own greatest triumph in public to save his neck. And at first, you'll love this, nobody believes him. Of course they don't. Think about what he's claiming. He's saying that the most revered Vermeer expert in the world was completely taken in, that museums full of trained eyes hung his kitchen forgeries as masterpieces, that a whole nation of scholars and dealers and critics had been fooled for years by a man they'd all dismissed. The art establishment did not want that to be true. Imagine being told your entire life's expertise had been made a fool of by the very man you'd sneered at. It was easier, frankly, to believe he was a traitor inventing a wild story than to believe he'd humiliated all of them. His confession sounded like a desperate man saying anything to dodge a firing squad. So he had to prove it. And here is the scene I would give almost anything to have watched. To demonstrate that he really could do it, Jan van Meegeren was given canvas, and paint and brushes, and under guard, under observation, watched by the authorities. He sat down and painted a brand new Vermeer from scratch. A religious scene in the old master's manner, made to order, to prove the hand that could fool the world was his. Picture it. The forger, on trial for his life, performing his crime in front of witnesses as his defense. The only man in history, perhaps, who had to commit forgery in public to prove his innocence of something worse. And it worked. Between the new painting and the physical evidence, that telltale modern plastic in the paint of the old masters, the whole chemistry that could not have existed in Vermeer's century, the truth became undeniable. The lost Vermeers were exposed, one after another, as the work of Hermann van Meegeren. The treason charge fell away. He hadn't sold a national treasure to Goring. He'd sold him a fraud, and in doing so, this is the part that made him a legend. He had, in the public imagination, swindled and humiliated one of the most hated men of the age. And that is the moment Hermann van Meegeren stopped being a criminal and became, to a lot of people, a hero. Think about the story from the outside, the way the newspapers told it. A little Dutch painter, scorned by the arrogant experts, had turned around and made complete fools of them, and not only them, but Hermann Goering himself. He'd taken the enemy's money for a worthless picture. In a bruised, humiliated, just liberated country desperate for something to feel good about, he became a kind of folk champion. The man who conned the Nazi, the clever underdog who beat the smug establishment and the fascist looter in one stroke. People adored him for it, and I understand the appeal completely. I feel the tug of it myself. That's why I'm sitting here telling you the story with a grin. But this is exactly where I have to stop and put the grin away and be honest with you, because a con is only a magic trick until you remember there are real people on the other side of it. Because the folk hero version is a lovely, flattering lie, and it leaves too much out. Yes, he fooled Goring, but that was a happy accident of the war, not the plan. For years before any Nazi walked into Holland, Van Meegeren had been getting rich by deceiving his own countrymen, Dutch collectors, Dutch museums, Dutch experts, ordinary buyers who trusted the art world and paid enormous sums for lies. He didn't strike a noble blow for wounded artists. He ran a long, cold, extremely profitable fraud, and the revenge was just the excuse he told himself while the money piled up. And there's a darker note still, one the cheerful legend scrubs right out. There is evidence that Van Meegeren was not exactly an enemy of the Nazi cause, that his own sympathies leaned that way. There's a notorious detail that a book of his drawings, warmly inscribed, made its way to Adolf Hitler himself. Now, historians debate the exact depth of his politics, and I won't pretend to certainty I don't have. But the tidy picture of a patriotic little hero cheerfully sticking it to the fascists, that is not the man. The real man is murkier, greedier, and a good deal less comfortable to root for. He was a gifted swindler with a wounded ego who got lucky enough to fleece a monster, and then let the whole world reward him for it. Both things are true at once. And I'd be a bad guide if I only showed you the fun one. So how does it end for him? Not with the firing squad, and not, in the end, in glory either. The forgery charges caught up with the man the treason charge had let go. In 1947, Hermann van Meegeren was put on trial for fraud and forgery, for the paintings, the fakes, the fortune built on lies. And this is one of history's gentle ironies. The trial was almost a friendly affair. The public half adored him by now, the man who'd fooled everyone, and the mood was closer to fascination than fury. He was convicted, yes. He was guilty, plainly, but he was sentenced to only about a year in prison. A single year for one of the most spectacular art frauds ever committed. The nation that should have been furious at being duped had mostly decided to be delighted instead, but he never served it. Hermann van Meegeren's heart and his health were wrecked years of the strain, and the drink, and the pills, and the enormous secret he'd carried. Not long after his conviction, before he ever spent that year behind bars, he suffered a heart attack and died at the end of 1947. The scorned imitator who dreamed of proving himself the equal of the masters died the most famous forger in the world, celebrated, notorious, and in a way he never planned, finally taken seriously. Just not for the reason he'd wanted. Not for his own paintings, the ones with his real name on them. For the lie. For the lie, they'll remember him forever. And there's the last twist of the knife. He'd spent his whole life aching to be recognized as a great original artist. He got recognition beyond his wildest dreams as history's greatest imitator. He is immortal precisely for the thing he set out to disprove, that his genius was for copying other men. He won the argument by losing it. I don't know whether to laugh or ache, and honestly, most nights I do a bit of both. Now here's why I keep coming back to this one, long after the fun of it wears off, because it says something about you and me that I can't quite shake. Van Meegeren didn't beat the experts by being a better technician than they were observers. That's not really what happened, and it's the comfortable version. What he actually did was smarter and more unsettling. He gave them a picture that confirmed exactly what they already wanted to be true. They believed a lost religious Vermeer should exist. So when one appeared, their expertise didn't protect them, it betrayed them. All that knowledge, all that training, quietly rearranged itself to defend the conclusion they were already longing for. The greater the expert, in a way, the deeper the trap, because the more sure you are that you can't be fooled, the less you look. And before you feel too superior to poor old Bredius, don't. Because you do this too. I do it too. We all walk around every day seeing what we already expect to see. You get a message that looks like it's from your bank, and it lands right in the middle of a day when you were half expecting the bank to message you. And your guard, the guard that would catch it any other moment, is down because it fits. You read the headline that confirms what you already believed and you nod and share it, and you scrutinize the one that contradicts you down to the last comma. The forger's real trick wasn't chemistry. It was knowing that a human being will swallow almost anything, no matter how outlandish, as long as it's shaped like something they already wanted. My nephew, sharp kid, I've talked about him before, thinks he's far too clever to be caught, nearly handed his savings to a scam last year for exactly this reason. It wasn't that the fake was flawless. It was that it arrived dressed as good news he was hoping for, and hope switched his caution off. He caught it with about a minute to spare, and only because for 1 second he stopped believing what he wanted to believe and actually checked. That second is the whole defense. Against Van Meegeren, against Bredius's blind spot, against the message in your inbox tonight. The one small, unglamorous act of doubting the thing you most want to be true. So that's my question for you, and I do read the comments, so come find me down there. When have you believed something, a person, a bargain, a story, a message, mostly because you wanted it to be true? And what was the little crack in the paint, the detail that finally didn't fit, that gave it away, if anything did? Or did it get you? Tell me honestly. The ones where it got you are the ones that teach the rest of us the most, so don't be shy. Put it below. I'll leave you with this. Van Meegeren proved something I find genuinely beautiful and genuinely frightening in the same breath. That the sharpest eyes in the world are not defeated by a better forger. They are defeated by their own longing. He didn't paint a picture good enough to fool Bredius. He painted the picture Bredius was praying to find, and let the praying do the rest. Half of me will always love him for the sheer nerve of it, a scorned little man who cooked a masterpiece in his oven and made the whole clever world kneel. The other half remembers all the people he robbed on the way to becoming a hero, and the fact that fooling a Nazi was luck, not virtue. He was never quite the man the legend made him. Almost nobody ever is. So the next time something arrives looking exactly like what you hoped for, a lost treasure, a lucky break, a message that fits too well, do the one boring thing the greatest expert in the world forgot to do. Doubt it. Check the paint. Because the con that gets you is never the one you're braced for. It's the one you were already hoping would come. I'm Eddie. Trust the boring second. And that's how you lose your shirt.